after the Civil War, there was this massive vision for a new South, one filled with industry, progress, and prosperity. But underneath that glittering surface, there was this dark, really violent contradiction. So let's dive into this story of a region trying to build a new future while being completely haunted and honestly defined by its past.
This right here, this was the rallying cry. It was spoken back in 1886 by a guy named Henry Grady, an editor from Atlanta. And it was a really bold declaration, right? A promise to the entire nation that the South was ready to turn the page, to embrace the future, and just leave the old ways behind. But the big question is, was any of it really true?
All right, so here's our roadmap. We're going to track the rise of this new South idea, and then we're going to peel back the layers to see the shadow of the past lurking underneath. We'll look at the absolutely brutal reign of terror that forced a new racial order into place, and how that terror got turned into the law of segregation. And we'll unpack the powerful lost cause myth that was created to justify the whole thing. And then at the end, we'll ask, was this new South actually new at all?
So what was this vision for a new South? Well, at its heart, it was all about economics.
You had these boosters, guys like Henry Grady, who looked at the industrial powerhouse of the North and basically said, "We want that." They were out there campaigning for new railroads to connect the dots, for factories to process things like tobacco and textiles, and for Northern money to come on down and fund it all. It was, a very forward-looking plan to escape the devastation of the war.
But here's the thing. This big push for a new future was really driven by a deep, deep fear of the recent past and the chaos of the present.
I mean, just think about the sheer scale of the disruption here. The Confederacy's defeat didn't just wreck the economy, it completely flipped the South's entire social structure on its head. The emancipation of 4 million African Americans, well, that just erased the very foundation of the Old South's wealth and its power. For a lot of white Southerners, this new reality was a source of just profound fear, anger, and resentment.
And that fear, that anger, and that resentment, it absolutely exploded. It exploded into a wave of unimaginable violence that was designed to reestablish white supremacy by any means necessary.
This number, it's just staggering. Between the 1880s and the 1950s, roughly 5,000 African Americans were murdered by white mobs. These were extra-legal killings called lynchings. And make no mistake, this was not just about punishment. It was about sending a terrifying message. What is so horrifying is how organized and public all of this was. These weren't some secret hidden acts of violence. No, they were public spectacles, almost like carnivals. They would charter special trains just to bring in spectators who would then collect souvenirs and even pose for photographs. The entire goal was to terrorize the black community into submission. To really get the horror, you have to look at a case like Sam Hose in Georgia back in 1899. After an accusation, a mob captures him. Word spread so fast that special trains brought 4,000 spectators all the way from Atlanta. He was then publicly tortured and burned alive. This one case just perfectly illustrates the ritualistic public nature of this terror.
And this violence wasn't condemned by the people in power. It was celebrated. It was championed. This quote, it's from Rebecca Latimer Felton, a really prominent women's rights activist who would later become the first woman to ever serve in the U.S. Senate. Her words just show how deeply this twisted ideology was embedded in the mainstream.
In the political leaders, they were even more blunt about it. Here you have the governor of South Carolina, Coleman Blease, openly saying that he would throw the Constitution in the trash to enforce this racial order. The message couldn't have been clearer. There was no legal protection from mob rule.
Now, this terror wasn't just about individual lynchings. It was a tool for political control. In Wilmington, North Carolina, an armed mob of white Democrats literally overthrew the legally elected biracial government. They murdered dozens of people, banished their political opponents from the state, and installed their own people in power. It was a coup d'etat, plain and simple.
So once this reign of terror had successfully crushed black political power and silenced any opposition, the next step was to make this new social order permanent and legal.
You can just watch the progression on this timeline. What started as just custom and violence was quickly written into law. It began with things like separate railroad cars, then it moved to systematically stripping away the right to vote with poll taxes and literacy tests. And then the Supreme Court's separate but equal ruling in Plessy v. Ferguson, well, that gave the whole thing a federal stamp of approval.
And these became the pillars of the Jim Crow South. It was a total system of racial apartheid. From where you could sit on a train to who you are allowed to marry, these laws, always backed by the constant threat of violence,
governed every single aspect of life to ensure a rigid racial hierarchy.
Now, to justify this brutal new order, the South needed a new story about its past, a myth, really, that could wash away the stain of slavery and rebellion.
This myth came to be known as the Lost Cause, and it was a deliberate, coordinated effort to literally rewrite history. It tried to present the Confederacy not as a failed nation built to protect slavery, but as some noble, heroic society that was just fighting for its rights against a tyrannical North. So, the really crucial point here is that these weren't just sentimental memories, they were specific, and they were false claims. The myth argued that the war wasn't about slavery, that enslaved people were actually content, and that Confederate leaders like Robert E. Lee were these chivalrous heroes. It was an incredibly powerful form of cultural propaganda. And this myth was literally set in stone. Confederate monuments started popping up all across the South, cementing this revisionist history right there in public spaces. It was also powerfully spread through pop culture, most famously in that hugely successful 1915 film Birth of a Nation, which actually portrayed the Ku Klux Klan as the saviors of the South.
Okay, so let's bring this all together. You've got a vision of industrial progress, a reality of racial terror, and a myth to justify it all. So what was the final result?
This table really lays out the central contradiction of the whole era. I mean, yes, new railroads were built and factories did spring up, but look at what stayed the same. The region was still the poorest in the entire nation. The economy was still overwhelmingly agricultural, and most importantly, white supremacy and racial segregation were more dug in than ever before.
This quote really just sums it all up, doesn't it? Industrial development and Jim Crow didn't contradict each other. They actually coexisted. The progress was real, sure, but it was all built on this foundation of profound inequality and oppression. The New South, in so many of the ways that truly mattered, wasn't new at all.
And this leaves us with a pretty critical question to think about. The story of the New South really shows us that you can't just declare the past dead. When a society tries to build a modern future without honestly confronting its history, the old problems, well, they don't just disappear. They find new and often much more violent ways to live on.